Renaissance history.
Sorry.
And I asked him if he would be able to do this kind of presentation, but he said, no, it's not really his subject. He recommended our speaker today, and I'd like to introduce him. He's a professor, Jesse Kaufmann. He teaches European political and cultural history in Eastern Michigan with a focus on Germany and Poland, and has also taught classes on 20th century Russia. He has a BA degree from UCLA and his MA and PhD from Stanford. He's published a book about World War I on the subject of German occupation of Poland. He's a member of St. Thomas Catholic Church in Ann Arbor. Most importantly, he's a Navy veteran. So let's welcome Jesse Kaufmann.
Is this working? You hear me okay? Okay, so I'm sorry I don't have an outline. I usually like to hand an outline out because I don't use PowerPoints really, but I had no power this morning. So I hope that I can kind of keep the big structure clear. I'm very happy that Dean asked me here to give this today, in part because this is one of those odd events in which people that who I usually find myself on the same side of things with have been saying a number of, to me, strange and actually ill-informed things about what is happening in Ukraine. It's incredibly complicated. And so today, you know, I'd like to give the broad historical background. And the title of the talk is actually, "There's no such thing as a Ukrainian," in quotes, because Putin says this all the time, and he absolutely means it. But Russians have been saying that for 200 years. So I'm going to talk about where that idea comes from. And like Dean, I have I've had an intense interest in this because I've been to Ukraine for lots of conferences. Lviv was a beautiful city. I've got lots of friends there. I've got lots of friends who are here, but their family is still there, including one friend who his parents lived through the Second World War in Kyiv and are now living through this, and they refuse to leave. So it's been pretty traumatic for him. Okay, so before I talk about the broad historical background, I do want to just give one tidbit out of chronological order because it's so important for understanding why we are caught up in what's going on in Ukraine. And that is something called the Budapest Memorandum. You hear people talk about, well, it's because NATO and all of this has nothing to do with that. Well, that does scare Putin, but that's not why we're there. In 1994, as the Soviet Union broke apart, the State Department and the US military establishment's number one concern, and understandably so, was what was going to happen to Russia's nuclear arsenal. And a large portion of that arsenal was in what is now Ukraine. So there was a lot of tension, a lot of stress, a lot of worry that we were just going to kind of disappear. And so we signed an agreement, us, the Russians, and the Ukrainians, according to which the Ukrainians agreed to give up the nuclear weapons and Russia agreed to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity. So, you know, whenever somebody starts talking about, well, because NATO has, well, what about the Budapest Treaty? And they've never heard of it, usually. So we said that we would support Ukraine if their territorial integrity was threatened by the Russians. The Russians agreed that they would not threaten it. So that is the immediate, in a sense, diplomatic, political background to what is happening now. They have violated that agreement. And unfortunately, for those of us who worry about nuclear weapons, the lesson is clear. Do not give up your nuclear weapons. This would not be happening. And the Ukrainians knew it. They did not want to give it up. And in retrospect, it seems that they were right. I hate to say it because I hate nuclear weapons, but this wouldn't be happening if they'd kept them. Okay, so let me talk about the broad historical background. I didn't know the map would be so far away. I was going to interact with them, so sorry about that. So let's start with the idea, you know, the question, where does Ukraine come from? So the map on your left, and you'll have to take my word for it, I guess, is a map of the Russian Empire in, say, the 19th century. So the Russian Empire was multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious. You know, you had Lutheran-speaking Baltic languages, you had Catholic Poles, and so on. And it's broken up into provinces. Now, the area that is now Ukraine is on sort of the bottom left. There is no province called Ukraine. In part because the Russians have always thought of it as a region. It's not a country to them. It's not an administrative unit even. In fact, the word Ukraine probably comes from a Slavic word meaning borderland, because u in most Slavic languages is a preposition meaning at. Krai means country. So Ukraina sort of means like the borderland. The way I explain it to, for example, my students is, for the Russians, it's kind of like saying the Midwest. Like, it's not a country, it's a place. And it maybe has some distinguishing characteristics, but it's not a nation. And that is still how the Russians think of it. And that is why when people want to make a political point, even though there's no definite articles in the Russian language, if they are promoting the Russian view, they will say the Ukraine. Because what they're saying is that region, the borderland region. Whereas if you leave off the article and just say Ukraine, you are talking about a country which they say doesn't exist. So for the several hundred years that Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, and this is where on the Ukrainian side you sometimes run into some sort of fantastical myth-making, the people who lived there did not consider themselves as fundamentally different really from the Russians. So in the Russian view of the Russian ethnic group, there's one ethnic group, the Russians, and it has three kind of branches: the Great Russians, or what we would really think of as the Russians. The White Russians become, what is today Bielorussia. Biel is white in Russian. And the Little Russians, who eventually become the Ukrainians. But for much of the 19th century, 18th century, they went by different names: Little Russians, or sometimes Ruthenians, or there were just different things they called themselves. Again, in part because Ukraine was a region more than anything else. So, in the 19th century, though, in the 1800s, people began, primarily sort of intellectual types, poets, historians, who were always causing trouble, began to advance the argument that no, in fact, the people who live in this region are a totally different nationality. They're not a subgroup of the Russians. They're something different. They're a nation. The Russians are over there. They are a different nation, and they are called Ukrainians. They have, according to these people, their own language, and most importantly, their own history. It can be interesting for a historian to listen to Russians and Ukrainians talk about their history, because they begin it at the same period, which is the Christianization of what's called the Kievan Rus, which was some sort of weird Viking hybrid state. And they each claim to be the true descendants of that state. The Ukrainians say, well, we've been here since the year 800. The Russians say, no, that was somebody else. They migrated north and became us. But in the 19th century, you had this small group of people. That's where it really starts, this idea that there is a nationality called the Ukrainians. One problem that the kind of intellectuals who came up with this faced, and it is something that is affecting what's going on right now and making it so messy, is that most of the people that they would have considered Ukrainians, that I would say 95% of them, were peasants who lived in the countryside. Like a lot of Eastern Europe, the cities had a very different socio-ethnic structure than the countryside. And Ukrainians lived in the countryside. The cities were German, Jewish, Polish, and overwhelmingly Russian, particularly as heavy industry began to develop. Most of those workers came from Russia. And you can see this geography in the conflict now, that it starts in the east where there is a Russian separatist movement, can't deny that. Well, that's where a lot of the mining and other heavy industry was. Those people were Russians, as were the people in the cities. We'll talk in a second about how that slowly becomes less true as the 20th century goes on, but it's a fact and it remains a fact. Complicating it is what now Russian or Ukrainian national identity means, because now you can really be Russian but consider yourself a Ukrainian, like Zelensky. Zelensky's native language is Russian, but he is now obviously unmistakably Ukrainian. But these boundaries were always kind of blurry. The languages they insist are totally, not like each other. I have pretty rudimentary Russian, which surprisingly turns out to mean I also have rudimentary Ukrainian. I mean, I can tell what the signs say and stuff. They're not that different. So, but I wouldn't tell them that. Okay. So that's sort of the big broad background. So where does the modern struggle begin? I would say it begins in the First World War. So in the early 20th century, this kind of Ukrainian agitation increases. They want autonomy within the Russian Empire. The Russians see this, so their main enemy in this region is the Austrians. They also have a small Ukrainian population. They see the whole Ukrainian thing as something completely made up by the Austrians. So when Putin says today, Ukrainian is not a real thing, it's made up by NATO, you can draw a straight line. This is exactly what they were saying in 1890. The Austrians have fabricated this identity. They call it Ukrainians. They've done it only to undermine Russia. So in 1917, the Russian Empire collapses, and some of the ethnic groups begin to mobilize themselves to try and carve out like an autonomous space of some sort in the ruins of the empire. Most of them at first don't want to break away. They want to be within the empire, but have their own culture, whatever, Estonian or, Belarusian or Polish and so on. But the first to mobilize and to form a distinctly independent government, although they did not want to break away from Russia at first, was the Ukrainians. In 1917, almost, I would say like a week after the Tsar fell, there was a distinctly Ukrainian government in Ukraine. They pulled Ukrainian soldiers out of the Imperial Russian Army. I would say by March 1917, they probably had something like a real Ukrainian state in embryo. They had ministries, they had an elected body, actually. They had an army. So at that moment, there is undeniably a Ukrainian polity of some sort that arises out of these ashes. At first, they do not want to break away from Russia because they see their fortunes as being somehow, it's a hostile world. Are they really better off being by themselves? Maybe they're better off in this big, huge empire. But the Russians don't want it. So before the communists take over, I almost said commies, sorry. Before the communists take over, there is a liberal government, and they try and work something out with the Ukrainians, and it just ends up not being possible. The Ukrainians essentially want to run their own country and just be in some kind of nominal federation with the liberal Russian government, and they say no. And then the Bolsheviks take power, communists, in late 1917, and their answer is also the same, no. There's no such thing as a Ukrainian. The whole idea of national identity is a middle-class fabrication, they think, so. So this begins an absolutely horrific war because the Bolsheviks invade Ukraine, and the way communist armies operate at this time, they always have people inside who engage in an armed uprising at the same time. So it sort of mixes a civil war with a foreign war. And so the Soviets invade late or early 1918, somewhere around there, to try and force Ukraine to stay in. in the Soviet Union. Well, it doesn't exist yet, but to stay within some kind of Bolshevik communist polity that is obviously going to be dominated by the Russians. The war lasts until 1921. Horrific casualties. It pulls in the Poles, who the Ukrainians had just fought a war with in 1918, in the ruins of the Austrian Empire. There are anarchist warlords operating in the territory of what is now Ukraine. So you basically have communist Ukrainians, Poles, warlords, anarchists, all fighting each other in this territory. Finally, the communists defeat the Ukrainian government that arose out of that collapse. They defeat the Ukrainian army. They sign an agreement with Poland saying that they would no longer support the Ukrainians, which they had been doing. And the communist government, including Lenin, establishes the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. This is the moment that Vladimir Putin thinks is when this war began. He'll talk about it like it happened yesterday. I mean, we're talking about a guy who thinks Lenin was a big softie and, it was too nice. He thought it was a huge mistake that, Lenin gave in to the Ukrainian nationalists. And if he hadn't done that, the whole idea of Ukraine would have just faded away. But what he's dealing with now in his mind is a mistake made by Lenin. And it's interesting, at the end of the First World War, when the Poles go to from Poland, they go to the peace treaty talks. They actually, because they dispute some territory with the Ukrainians, they tell the Allies the same thing that Russia has been saying. There's no such thing as a Ukrainian. It was all fabricated by the Austrians. They just made it up. And before the war, even, mention this before I forget, what the Russians are doing now in the territories, they're tearing down the churches, they're closing down bookstores that sell Ukrainian language books, they tear down road signs that have Ukrainian names on them. Russian Empire did all that stuff in the beginning of the 20th century as well. In part, to combat this idea that there was such a thing as a Ukrainian. So it's forbidden to publish books in the Ukrainian language. It's forbidden to, be a part of any sort of society that promoted Ukrainian interests or Ukrainian culture. We'll get to religion in a second because it can't be separated from what's going on here. But they did force the Ukrainians, some of them, to convert to Orthodoxy. So that battle, again, what the Russians are doing now, it's crazy to me because I study this. You pick up the Wall Street Journal and read about Russians, vandalizing Ukrainian bookstore. It's like it's 1904 all over again. It's very strange. So that began life for Ukraine, kind of. So as of this time, there has never been, by this point, say 1921, there has never been a country called Ukraine. The territory that ends up becoming part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, on the right is a German map actually showing present-day Ukraine, some of its various borders. It looks pretty much like that in the Soviet Union as well. It's sort of cobbled together from different Russian provinces that have large Ukrainian-speaking populations in the countryside. But it's part of the Soviet Union, right? So it has no independent life, and it's even questionable how Ukrainian it really is, because you know much about the history of the Soviet Union. Despite their claims to be beyond nationality somehow, the party apparatus, which dominated political and social and cultural life, is thoroughly Russian. So the party apparatus in Ukraine, despite attempts to make it more Ukrainian from time to time, is Russian. But in the 60s and 70s, you do get more Ukrainians moving into the cities. In part because after World War II, most of the people who've been living there are either dead or have been driven off. So you do get the beginnings of a migration and kind of urbanization. Talk in a minute about this, but that's sort of what culminates early 2000s with when this all started. Was looking through some of my pictures and I had forgotten, but when I was there, and I think already in 2013, we went to a cemetery in Lviv where there were graves for soldiers who'd been killed fighting the separatists in the east. So for the Ukrainians, it's been going on for quite a long time. So Ukraine, again, obviously not independent under the Soviets, but when the Soviet Empire collapses, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic declares itself independent. They are recognized in 1991 by various other countries. And so that's really the beginning of the moment when modern Ukrainian state begins its existence. In the Russian view, what happened was in a moment of weakness and confusion and transition, a group of kind of criminals took advantage of them, sort of kicked them when they were down, and created this country that they believe should never have existed. What Putin really wants, as far as I can read him, is Ukraine was supposed to become like Bielorussia, which most people, had never even heard of, but it's the next country up. It's basically denationalized. It's controlled by Russia. It's backwards. And where Ukraine was headed was really upsetting to him. Because after communism fell, obviously Ukraine had problems. Corruption is a problem in all of these post-Soviet states. Sometimes when I hear people talking about Ukrainian corruption, it reminds me of even the Second World War when people would say, well, who's Churchill to criticize the Nazis? The British have an empire. Like, I don't see how that matters, right? We're clearly not dealing with two moral equals, I think. In any event, yes, there was corruption there, but clearly, and I can testify to this firsthand, Ukraine was becoming a vibrant and, for lack of a better word, westernized country. The main trouble with Russia began when there was a fraudulent election. It was obviously rigged when some Putin flunky was elected to high office, and there were big demonstrations, and he had to flee the country. And the demonstrations were really led by young Ukrainians who had moved to the cities within, say, a generation, and were highly westernized and well-educated and did not want to become this kind of post-Soviet bad Yellow-Russia or whatever. And, they weren't going to have it. So they demanded that this guy get thrown out, and they elected somebody else. And then later they elected Zelensky, who was fairly elected. So that has tormented Putin more than anything to do with NATO, that they are clearly slipping away. And I would argue they were on the verge of becoming a far more impressive success story than Russia, which has some serious problems that seem to get worse every year. But all right. So that is what leads to Putin's invasion, his calculation that he had to act or Ukraine would be gone forever. Now, it is complicated by the fact that in many of those eastern areas where the Russians are operating, there are a lot of Russians. And not that long ago, they were agitating for annexation by Russia. There's no denying that. It was a fairly strong movement. But I suspect that part of the reason he invaded was because he realized, perhaps, that had largely run out of steam. And as Ukraine sort of became more prosperous or, relatively stable under the rule of law, living in Putin's Russia was much, much less attractive. They may have still considered themselves Russians in a kind of state run by a pretend nationality, but nonetheless, I don't think they wanted to be part of Russia anymore. But they are there, they were there and they are there, which is very interesting following along some of the cities where just say 5-6 years ago, the demonstrations were quite large in favor of Russia. They have resisted almost fanatically military conquest. It's once foreign troops cross your border, it seems people find a way to put things aside and come together. And that has definitely happened in Ukraine. All right. So, talk a bit now about how religion factors into all this, just kind of one of the first things Dean had asked me about. So this is also rooted in some complicated currents of Russian history. I would say the first thing to know is that there's no real separation of church and state in Russia. Now, it changes over the centuries, and who actually has the power, it shifts. You know, the Synod of Bishops tries to preserve its autonomy against the state, and the state tries to get involved in ecclesiastical affairs. And it goes back and forth over hundreds and hundreds of years. But nobody's ever saying that those two shouldn't have anything to do with each other. It's just the points on which they overlap are points of disagreement. But the way I think I put it, to make it a bit more clear, is that whatever the relationship between church and state in Russia is, there is, and there, except for the Soviet period, never was a distinction between religion and state. That is the language, the institution, to some degree or lesser degree, depends on the person, the beliefs of religion are in no way seen as separate from or distinct from the political structure, the cultural life of the Russian Empire. They're all one in the Russian Empire, and they've become one again, or under Putin, he's trying at least. Certainly the state has the upper hand right now. I don't know if you've read about this, but in the past 10 years, there have been Russian-funded Russian Orthodox churches opening all over Europe. There's one in like downtown Paris on the banks of the Seine. And who thought that was a good idea? I don't know, but it turns out, not surprisingly, they're almost all fronts for Russian foreign intelligence operatives. They're not there for spiritual purposes. They're there to project power of the Russian state and also give a place for their spies to hang out. And this has a long history in Russia, this sort of cooperation between church and state, in that the higher clergy for centuries have always seen themselves as guardians of and defenders of a divinely ordained political order. As you could not separate out what they saw as the unique mission of the Russian Orthodox Church. You could not separate that out from the divinely ordained political structure of the Russian Empire. Nicholas II, who was killed by the communists, went to his grave in the 20th century well and truly believing that he ruled by divine right. He really believed that, and the Russian Orthodox Church believed that. That's why they've actually made him a saint recently. And on the other side of Detroit, there's a Russian Orthodox monastery called Saint Sabas, I think, that as a fundraiser, they have this incredible restaurant. Like, it's probably one of the best restaurants in the state. It's only open one day a week, though. But it's interesting because if you go in, there's icons of Saint Nicholas II, Tsar Nicholas, in that sort of Eastern Orthodox style, which is interesting. They also have a sign up saying they support Ukraine. So there must be interesting things going on in the back rooms of that monastery. So the czars, or the church sees itself as a protector of the state, and the state is absolutely happy to use the church, its institutions, its beliefs to preserve its power, in part because the Russian Empire, there's always a sense that it's kind of fragile. It needs something to hold it together. It's so massive. And the czars, the emperors, are definitely want to use the church. This increases in the 1800s after the Napoleonic Wars, when everything's unsettled and destroyed and in flux. and seems unstable. Tsar Nicholas I, I think it's one of his ministers comes up with it actually, this slogan for his reign: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, autocracy, nationality. Basically, he kind of brought Orthodox religious teachings back to the schools, and he wanted a close, mingling of church and state and religion and state power, and he wanted to use the church to project the power and the unifying potential of the czar. And I've seen like political analysts say that, and they're probably right, that Putin is deliberately modeling himself on Tsar Nicholas I, because it is something I used to argue with my dad about all the time. He's finally seen I'm right. Putin is support, he gives all this money to monasteries and the churches and so on. It is solely for the reason of preserving his own power and legitimating his own power. He's a KGB operative, right? He made his way in the world in the Soviet Union. He was very successful. He doesn't care about the Russian Orthodox Church, except insofar as it serves the purpose of maintaining Russian power, which, as you see, has been an idea that's been around for quite some time. It's also complicated in that for many Russians today, even those who aren't believers, the Orthodox religion is seen as part of that kind of vague term that we use called ethnicity, right? Which is partially kind of like your biological ethnic group, but it's also cultural. And so the Russian Orthodox Church is seen as part of what it means to be Russian, even if you have never been in a church, never stood and prayed in front of an icon. There are still plenty of Russians who believe that and will identify themselves as Orthodox, even though they don't believe anything. Because in the way there's a lot of Italians who say they're Catholics. They've never been, maybe they were baptized. They probably haven't been back to a church since. So no separation between religion and politics, no real separation between religious identity and ethnic identity in Russia. To be Russian is to be Orthodox and vice versa. So that brings us to Kirill, current patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And he has played a major role in legitimating Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which again seems odd to us, but in the grand scope of sweep of Russian history is nothing new, is in fact predictable. Church and state are supposed to support each other. Specifically, Kirill's views seem to align really quite well and overlap almost seamlessly with Putin's. Kirill, by the way, so the Soviet Union was officially atheist, right? It was an atheist state, and made some concessions to belief by having this kind of very small Russian Orthodox church structure. But obviously, it's a totalitarian state. It's not separate from the communist state. It can't be. Maybe if you're just kind of a parish priest, you could kind of keep your head down and do what you see as your spiritual duties, but it's a political institution. Kirill made his way up through that hierarchy while it was under the communist rule. And the only way you can have a career like that with the communists is by cooperating with the state. I have no doubt that Russian archives are full of files of Kirill informing on people, telling on them, because that's how you get ahead in that system. He was allowed to go abroad in the 70s and serve on some ecumenical council. You didn't get that job by being a good shepherd of your flock, right? You got it by being a good operative of the communist state. So, I don't know, you might have seen this, Dean, when you were poking around the internet, but he's always caught wearing these like $10,000 watches. So it's hard to say what he really believes. Is he, he may be an atheist for all I know, but he speaks the language of highly politicized orthodoxy with fluency. And the reason I think he's not totally just an opportunist is he is fairly consistent. So I'll just go over a couple of points where he really overlaps with Putin. Both he and Putin both lament the breakup of the Russian Empire. Both think that was a disaster for Russia as well as for the lesser peoples that found themselves under Russian tutelage. So both of them blame Lenin for recognizing the Ukraine, just like Putin. Kirill thinks that there is no Ukraine, there's no such thing as a Ukrainian. Putin cynically posits himself as some great defender of tradition, whereas Kirill does this somewhat more convincingly. He is very opposed to any, what he calls Western influences making their way into Russia. He sees the Russian people as, if he means it, spiritually unique. They must remain untainted by non-Russian influences, including non-Russian religions. So he's very opposed to all what he sees as contamination by Western ideas. The most obvious ones are things like, gay rights or whatever. Those are the obvious ones. But it's much broader than that. Things we might take for granted. Freedom of speech, no, well, that's a poisonous Western idea. Separation of church and state, there's no precedent for that in Russia. That's a Western idea. So, the idea that individuals can determine their own consciences, no, that's a poisonous Western idea. To be Russian is to be Orthodox. To be Orthodox is to be not those things. So he definitely sees it as a kind of war between Western influences and somehow authentically Russian spiritual influences. So he is perfectly happy, indeed, and I think he does mean it when he says that he supports Putin's war. I mean, he doesn't think Ukraine should exist. So this brings me to my last point, actually. So one thing that makes the Slavic world is that it is Orthodox generally, right? Some exceptions. But until quite recently, that is within the past few years, the religious landscape of Ukraine they were Orthodox and they were part of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarchate, right? And again, Russians see this as properly so, because they're not a nationality, they don't have anything distinctive, they're Orthodox, they're Russian Orthodox. So as things were getting ugly in the eastern borderlands, the Russian Orthodox Church, or the Ukrainian Orthodox clerics decided they were going to break away and found the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. There is really no way, there's no good comparison I can make with the institutions in our life for how momentous a step this was. It's almost like states seceding again. It would be that momentous. It's a huge deal, a huge deal, which is why I think the American diplomats didn't really understand what they were doing. And they sent this tweet out in the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. We congratulate the Ukrainian Orthodox Church on its recognition of its separate, because the other Orthodox patriarchs voted on it and they recognize it as a separate institution. This tweet infuriated the Russians. Putin took this as a personal provocation. Like, how dare we intervene in what is an internal Russian dispute and basically, back the side that he sees as traitors and secessionists and, and heretics and everything else. It's even phrased in this: we support all Ukrainians' ability to worship as they choose. That is alien to the Slavic world. That's one of those Western ideas that Kirill doesn't like. you don't worship as you choose. You worship as your nationality. You worship as your culture, right? You worship as the Russians tell you because you're part of Russia. Maybe they did know, but I think that even our diplomats probably don't understand how important this was to all the parties concerned. And now it's gotten really confusing because there's a breakaway Ukrainian Orthodox Church that wants to keep ties with Russia. But they're replaying some of the 19th century arguments. So I was looking at their webpage before I came here today, and it says something about, you know, the history of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And they date it to the baptism, the first baptism in Kiev and Rus in the 10th century, right? Which is when the Russians would say, no, their church started. So they're always claiming these they come from the same place, but one went in one way, but we are the true heirs of the tradition. So hopefully that brings a little, I don't know, background and broad outline to what is an extremely complicated and messy conflict that in many ways I would see has been going on really since 1917, which you could say has been going on since the 19th century. So whether that's a cause for hope or concern, I don't know, but we'll find out, I guess. Thank you for your time. So they did for a while, but as part of Putin's push to re-Russianize it, now it is much, much harder. And in fact, you may have seen this, the State Department recently sent out a warning, I think it was a week ago, telling all American citizens to leave Russia, which raises the question, who's there? Why would you be there right now? That doesn't seem like a good idea. But they specifically said, if you're part of a religious organization, they're gonna come get you. So, because it is now illegal to proselytize and all these sorts of things. So, yeah. Sure.
You said many times during your just believe this or don't believe that. How united are the largely talking about Putin? It's supporters, but the average Russian, or you know, how united or not united is that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. It's the $1 million question, and you know, so the question is, how united are the Russians? The best info that I have, because it's hard to say, you know, like I had a friend who's a Russian historian, and you know, we're connected on social media, but he can't say anything, or he's going to lose his job, he's going to go to jail. But the people I've read, who I respect and I think are right, say that you would be surprised at how much support there is for this, because almost like us in a way, the Russian victory in the Second World War is so central to their identity, and somehow a lot of people in Russia become convinced that this country with a Jewish president is run by Nazis. And here's some proof. When the Russians first showed up in some of those eastern towns, they were clearly not there to fight. Like they thought they were just going to chase away the leading Nazis and everybody would be glad to see them, right? Which is completely crazy. I mean, there are, in the East where that civil war was basically going on, there were some far right-wing militias who used Nazi imagery, but I think that had more to do with, I mean, it's obviously unsavory, right? But it was more about, well, what political system has killed the most Russians, right? Is the Nazis. So that's who they're gonna emulate. And, you know, some of them are supported by Jewish industrialists, so they're not refighting the Second World War, although they seem to think so. And they don't trust NATO. They think NATO made up the Ukrainians, just like the Austrians did in 1890. So distressingly widespread, it seems. I hope I'm wrong, but I think I'm not. Sure.
If I understood you correctly, you said it was in 2018 that the United States made that comment.
Yes.
That really provoked Putin.
Yes.
Why do you think he waited 3 years to make this move?
Oh, yeah, that's an excellent question. Why did he wait? I don't know. I think in this case, the unpredictable behavior of the president at the time may have factored into it.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
It's a theory that I find plausible. Because who knows, right? I mean, he could have gone and celebrated with them, or he could have nuked them. Who knows? You know, I think that's part of it. I do. Thanks.
Thank you.
Much opinions there about Putin's health and thinking assassins.
I hope a lot. I mean, I don't, the health thing seems to be true, right? I mean, he looks bad and he clearly shakes a lot. So I don't know about assassins. And one thing Ukrainians have been so good at is the information war. They are really good at that. I mean, my kids are all on the Ukrainian side because they follow it on TikTok. And they make these really, really good little TikTok videos, like with cats in them, because those always get on. So you have Ukrainian soldiers driving around with a cat. Whereas, and then the Russians will make something, it's like a bunch of school children singing about Putin and doing some weird communist era dance, and they're wearing these odd clothes, right? So the Ukrainians dominated the information war. Maybe they're planting this idea that there are. I mean, I'm sure they want Putin to think he's surrounded by assassins. I doubt he's the first person to eat his food every day. I do, I really do. So. Sure.
I heard on the radio, I think it was yesterday, that there were 150,000 Russian troops killed. Is that way off?
No, that's probably. I don't think it's in the realm of the inconceivable.
Okay, to follow up, I also have heard that troops or young men who would be conscripted are leaving the country, trying to escape.
They are. So there are men trying to get out, but there are a lot of their neighboring countries don't want them to come in. One of the reasons being, how can you tell who's really there to get away from military service? So I was in Poland in May, and it is full of Ukrainian. Like every train I got on was Ukrainian refugees, all women and children, which is also kind of an odd thing to see because the men aren't allowed to leave. So all the Ukrainians I saw were women and children. I want to start bringing in a bunch of young Russian men to that, right? Like, because you don't know who those guys are or what they're there for. And I follow the German newspapers pretty closely, and they've had some trouble with Ukrainians being harassed by Russians, fleeing conscription. Maybe they are, but they still don't like Ukrainians. So, Pastor.
Quite a lot of the nuance and many layers of what makes this conflict so bad, just many layers. As I think about it personally and how I feel about the conflict that's going on, one of those layers, and my comments are in no way meant to justify Putin,
Right.
He's committed horrible atrocities. But one of those layers is this cultural layer between Western and Eastern values. And as I think about it, I think we as conservative Christians would admit and rightly criticize our own Western culture and the amount of degradation of traditional values that has only, we were just talking about this on the Bible study before this, which has only ceased to serve our country, our society, and our people very poorly. Of how, and so in that way, I find it very hard to take the moral high ground and thinking that the Russians are wrong, saying that we need to advancement of Western culture on our traditions. Now, I'm not saying that's the only factor, but when you were talking about the church, that's
Right.
one of their concerns, at least one of their stated concerns. I'm trying to just figure out how, who am I to say that they need to go Western? There's so many issues with that.
Sure. Sure. And I, for example, tend to be an outlier among my colleagues because I see less Russia, I see Poland's case for that much, much more clearly. That the European Union is always trying to make them agree to things that they don't really believe. And the EU cannot get their heads around the fact that not everybody is going to be like post-45 Germany, right? There's a couple differences in Russia. One is that, I would not, yes, like our culture is in crisis and so on. Despite the image they project, I would not consider Russia a kind of great source of moral authority that, their degradation is worse, if anything. So yeah, I have students who have that same question. I always, even before the invasion, I said, these people are not our friends, right? They are not the guardians of some great thing that is in danger of being lost. If anything, they're destroying it. And the last thing I would say is that when I say Ukraine was being westernized, I don't mean that, next year there's going to be gay pride parades in every city. I just mean that, basic civil rights, freedom of conscience in terms of religion, freedom of speech are being respected. I mean, if you look at Belarusia, having the Russians come in and set themselves up as the guardians there of traditional values, it's not worked out very well for them. It's become a fourth world country, basically. So, I understand that appeal, but again, I would look to Poland, which actually believes it, rather than Kirill and Putin, who are communist operatives, basically. They'll defend what works for them. But that's just the way I see it. Thanks for the question, though. It's a big thing.
Zelensky seems to have great support.
Oh, no, it's definitely real. Yeah, he definitely does. Especially because he didn't leave, which I think a lot of people would have done. That's for sure. His life is definitely in danger. It still is. They'll kill him if they find him. Sure.
So then, the final question, I don't know the final question, but the ultimate is what's going to happen.
Yeah. It's what I think right now versus what I think when I'm laying awake at 4 a.m. thinking about this. Like, anything could happen. I think, what I hope is that eventually, I hate to say it, but we may have to get the Ukrainians to accept some cession of their sovereign territory in the East, I think, because otherwise it's going to grind on forever. It's going to be Vietnam, just year after year after year. Unless Putin uses his nuclear weapons, right? When I tell my students, teach about the Holocaust, they always say, well, Hitler keeps saying all this stuff all this time. Why did nobody do anything? And I always say, well, it's like Putin talking about nuking us. He talks about it all the time, right? But we just kind of figure nobody's really that crazy. But he might be. He might be. And to me, it's dangerous, in part because the basics of nuclear strategy is people say there's no way to win a nuclear war. It's not quite true. You win by striking first and completely destroying your enemy, right? That's unfortunately, how you win. So once that even becomes a possibility, right, then the stakes are raised considerably. The cost of miscalculating either way can be catastrophic. So I hope it ends. My prediction at the beginning was it ends with the Russian army disintegrating. That's still, I think, the best possible outcome. It's done it before in 1917. It seems to be doing it now. I don't think they're capable, really, of any major operations. Let's hope Putin dies. But he's so identified himself so personally with this that it's not going to end reasonably, I don't think. So we'll see, I guess.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all for your time.
Really appreciate your time and
Thanks for the invite.
information. It's a welcome piece of information that we don't always get a chance to have. Appreciate it. And we do have an honorarium for you.
Really?
Yep.
We got to do that.
Well, we do that. We really appreciate you coming, especially in the conditions